Ooh, ah, ooh, Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. It's episode 158. Today, I'm talking about the mighty, the Ponderosa Pine. I'm also going to be addressing a couple questions about, the trial and error of kiln drying. We're going to talk about a bunch of paper mills closing and what happens to that lumber. And then a little bit of a question on some framing lumber, specifically old framing lumber, which I thought is what really inspired the featured species of this episode, the Ponderosa Pine, because it is kind of a ubiquitous framing lumber. But I think we'll find out that it's a heck of a lot more than that. It's a tree that one could say entire civilizations have been built upon. Certainly countries have been built upon the Ponderosa Pine. But I do want to take a little bit of time to discuss a little bit of business. In the last couple of episodes, I talked about how I was reaching a threshold on my sticker inventory. You know, the stickers that I send out for featured species, like this particular month where we have a featured species of the Ponderosa Pine. Well, I threw out a deal. You know, my crazy deal where everybody who joined Patreon in the month of October and November would get 5 additional stickers, plus the Catalpa sticker, plus the sticker for this month, which is the Ponderosa Pine. Well, thank you. I've had a whole bunch of you respond and have certainly ameliorated that gap that I created. My forcing to order 100 more stickers when I only needed 1 more. The gap's not closed, but it's certainly closed a lot tighter than it was before. So yeah, thanks for the response. Thanks for the support of the show. Hopefully you guys will stick around for future stickers. See what I did there? It wasn't intentional. Sorry, I'm not really a punny type guy. But I am going to go ahead and continue this into November. So anybody who does become a Patreon Walnut tier subscriber in the month of November is going to get 5 stickers, plus the Catalpa sticker, and plus the sticker for November. Whatever that will be. I'm not going to announce it yet. I know what it is. I several people, my dogs know what it is, and I know what it is. The people who administer my Dropbox cloud account probably know what it is, but yeah, I'm not going to tell you. But speaking of featured species, we did talk about Catalpa last time, and I got an interesting array of responses to that. A lot of people who were really excited, they'd heard about the wood, but had no idea what it was, and had seen it even on racks, but had never tried it. Several people who wrote in and said that they'd seen it show up in some books from time to time, but never really thought of it as a lumber species. And then I got a series of death threats. People who were upset at me for outing their favorite secret species. I felt like I was having a conversation with a bunch of fishermen who I just publicly outed their secret fishing hole. There were a lot of you who are well aware of Catalpa and the beauty of the wood and the easy workability of it, and frankly, don't want to tell anybody about it because you don't want the prices to go up or you don't want your secret source for Catalpa to go away. So to those people, I do sincerely apologize. As a woodworker and frankly, a fly fisherman who has a few secret fishing holes, I get it. I get not wanting to give it up. But you know what? Catalpa is such an underutilized species that it is an under-harvested, undersawn species. And unless we spread the word about it, there's not going to be any market demand, which means it's always going to be difficult to find. So if this show drives up the popularity of Catalpa, maybe it will become more available. Now, yes, you might see some price spikes as the popularity goes up, but then as the supply meets it, it's always going to settle back down. In the end, it is a domestic species that should be readily available here in North America, and we really shouldn't see some massive price spikes in it. Knocking on wood, knocking on Douglas fir at this point. I do have a piece of Catalpa over there, but I'd have to get up to go knock on that. So anyway, I do appreciate those who wrote to me all very tongue-in-cheek about how you're going to hunt me down for outing your favorite species, honey hole. But I did get an interesting email from Andrew, who put his money where his mouth is and says, not only is one of my favorite species, I've done a lot of building with it. And he included a picture of a desk that he built for his son. For those watching the video, here is Andrew's desk. And I think I tried to characterize the wood as kind of grayish greenish cast to it, but I neglected to mention what happens when you put finish on this wood, and it goes crazy caramel brown. And this desk that Andrew built is a perfect example of just how gorgeous Catalpa is under finish. But more importantly, I find that the grain is super pronounced, super oaky in appearance, but closer grain. So it gives you a smoother, more contemporary look than a lot of grainy oaks would be, but some really interesting swirl grain. So thank you for sharing that picture. And thank you to everybody who wrote in saying that they love Catalpa. And even for those of you who threatened me for outing Catalpa. It's good to know that I hit a nerve, but I also uncovered a species that isn't so completely obscure. Next, I had an email from Patrick, and he's pointing to a story about Hurricane Helene and the impact on the timber industry in Georgia more than a year later. Now, this, I'm sharing it on the video. I'm sharing the screen here. This video they embedded is kind of interesting, but frankly, it takes for flipping ever to load, so I'm not even going to pull it up. But it is interesting to watch. I will include a link to this in the show notes and in the description on the YouTube page. It's interesting to watch the video just to see, I don't want to call it devastation, but it is devastation. A lot of the video takes place in these wide open rolling fields that look like cattle grazing land. And then you start to realize that that actually used to be a forest. So we're a year later, nature has reclaimed the open land and lots of grass is growing and things like that. And you would never know that there used to be a forest there. Occasionally you'll see these piles of debris and things. And that's where people have cleared up the downed trees, and what's left over is the burn piles. Yeah, nature has reclaimed it. And this is deforestation on a natural level. If you've ever seen a fire completely devastate a forest, so there's no stumps, nothing left, the greenery comes back pretty dramatically due to the fertilization and all the carbon and stuff from the fire. This is kind of shocking. Like, you would never know that they used to be standing on forest land. 40% loss of the timberland in Georgia, totally gone. Just grassy fields. Now, it's interesting to note that the forest that was there before Hurricane Helene wasn't old growth or first growth. It was second or third growth. These were plantations that, well, had been planted by the people who were currently harvesting them. Anywhere from 70 foot to 100 foot tall trees, in many instances characterized as third growth. But yeah, when it was cut down originally, it was probably clear cut, but I don't think clear cut to this level where the land has been completely reclaimed by grasses. So the question is, can we grow it back? Well, when you consider it's third growth timber, yeah, I don't see why it couldn't be grown back, but I do think the amount of work just to prep the land and the amount of time to grow it back from nothing might be a little hard for the timber industry to take in Georgia specifically, considering 40% loss. Now, fortunately, the species as a whole, mostly longleaf pine is what we're talking about. The species as a whole is, massively represented across the Southeast. So the demand, rather the supply, won't be affected that much. So hopefully Georgia will be able to recover. It's going to take a very concerted effort to see this, but in particular, I just wanted to highlight this, and I do urge you to go and watch this video just to see what happens when a forest is completely wiped out and how quickly it becomes grassy fields. It's upsetting. As somebody who likes forests and somebody who likes lumber, very upsetting. So with that, I think I'll move on to the featured species, but I do want to throw a little shout out to Chad in Kentucky. You know who you are. You listen to the show. Thank you for listening to the show. My domestic buyer at McIlvain was down visiting a bunch of mills and was talking to a guy, and he's like, I know your company. Why do I know your company? And my rep is rattling off all the things that we built and all the things we may have been known by and all this stuff. And finally he's like, do you work with a guy who has a podcast? So I'm glad to know that I work for the oldest lumber company in the country. And there are some parts of this country where we're known as from some idiot who does a podcast, not because of our lumber being in the Smithsonian or Independence Hall, but because of some idiot in his woodshop garage who does a podcast. So thank you, Chad. We've gotten quite a laugh about that around the office. I've gotten a fair amount of ribbing for being that podcast guy. So yeah, Appreciate that. Thanks for listening, Chad. Ponderosa Pine. Let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about the mighty Ponderosa. I was fortunate this past summer to take a trip out west. And for those watching the video, we've got Ponderosa pines flying by on the side of the road here. It's actually probably a little dizzying at the speed at which it's going. I probably should slow that video down. But Ponderosa pines are ubiquitous throughout the American West. Tall, tall trees, super straight trunks, high branches, so nice clear trunks, and this very distinctive plate-like bark. But the Ponderosa pine, it is, well, how does it get its name? Well, it gets its name because it's ponderous. It's tall. It looms over everything. The ponderous presence you see behind me is none other than the mighty Ponderosa pine. These are amazing fire-adapted species that grow these enormous, straight, tall trunks, take the branches up high above the fire line, but also propagate in fire because their cones only open under high heat, dispersing their seeds. The Ponderosa has been used for lumber for centuries, and when you look at this tree, it is a lumberman's dream. Just look at that trunk. And this is one of the smaller ones I've seen today. So I apologize to cutting over to a little bit of video. For those who listen to this podcast and not watch it on YouTube, you didn't miss much other than me, like an idiot, on a roadside, standing in front of a tree, talking to myself while holding an Osmo Pocket 3 camera. But I just couldn't resist as I passed all these trees to pull over and stand at the base of one and look up at that massive tree. And the trunk that I showed a close-up of, like I said, was one of the smaller ones. Some of the biggest ones were on steep hillsides, and as much as I wanted to climb out of the car and do that, I was in Custer State Park and probably would have been run over by buffalo or something along that line. But it is, I mean, if you live out west, you're like, whatever, they're everywhere. But for those of us who live in the Midwest and the East and parts of Europe and such, this is amazing. The pine trees that we have, yeah, some of them get big. The New England white pine or Northeastern white pine does get pretty big. But there's something about the Ponderosa pine because of the fact that it drops its branches early and its branches climb way up high above the fire line. It is truly a ponderous presence of a tree. It is in the yellow pine group, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a southern yellow pine. It's kind of the whitewood of the yellow pine group. Now, what do you know it as? Well, probably you've seen it on 1,001 lumber racks at Home Depot. It is that kind of whitish wood that's got a fair number of knots. You've probably seen it in 2x4s and 2x6s and 2x12s. This is kind of the, well, I'd say common grade of Ponderosa pine, but we'll learn that there's a fair bit of grading structures for this, both the structural and the appearance grade stuff. It is white enough that you could possibly mistake it for like hem fir that I find out here on the East Coast. But if you put them side by side, you'll notice that the Ponderosa has a little bit more of a yellowish cast to it. The structural grade stuff will often have a lumber stamp that says PP/LP or Ponderosa pine / loblolly pine or lodgepole pine. And this is the same as the hem/fir that we find across the eastern part of the United States. It is a construction grade material, but it's actually got a whole other life as a clear material. In fact, entire design styles, think Rocky Mountain rustic or ski lodge look, built around clear Ponderosa pine. And when you get it in clear, you can really start to see the contrast between the early growth and the late growth, which is what makes it in the yellow pine group as compared to the little to no contrast of the northern or eastern pine groups or the white pine groups. It definitely has that look, but it's just not as yellow, not as resinous. But I think it shows up a little bit more on the clear stuff. Where most people really hear about these days, especially in the high-end lumber sales, is the Beetle Kill Pine or the blue stain pine. And this is one of the things that Ponderosa is, well, infamous for these days. Not only Ponderosa, but lodgepole is the devastation due to the Rocky Mountain pine beetle. These are the trees that are being affected by the pine beetle. And the Excretions that the beetles leave behind are attract a fungus, create this staining, which has now become super popular and super chic in a lot of high-end installations where you're using the knotty wood, but also leaning upon that blue stained pine. I'm showing a particularly stained image. Now this has a little bit of finish on it to pop that blue, but blue stained or beetle kill pine is primarily coming from the Ponderosa and from the lodgepole pines. But let's talk a little bit about it. It is a tree that, it's iconic across North America. Like I said, it's got this towering stature. That's where it gets the name, its botanical name, Pinus ponderosa. Douglas, the same guy behind the Douglas fir, was the first one to kind of categorize it, and he noted its ponderous presence, which is where the whole Pinus ponderosa thing came from. And if you remember that fun fact I've mentioned probably 100 episodes ago, where these Latin botanical names that we talk about are not actually Latin. You get things like Pseudotsuga menziesii, which is the botanical name for Douglas fir. It's actually named after the naturalist Menziesii. That's his last name. Pinus ponderosa is another one. Ponderosa, ponderous, ponderous is a word. Ponderosa is not a Latin word. Quercus virginiana, or the live oak. Virginiana is not a Latin word. These are just, maybe it kind of started out Latin-y and they thought it felt scientific, and we'll just kind of go with it from there. So Pinus ponderosa, yeah, Douglas, the naturalist. And why am I forgetting his first name? I don't know. Joe Douglas. He's the one that coined the whole thing. But it towers over everything. It's got these big kind of plate bark pieces all over it. Really easy to stand out, but it's an incredibly versatile wood. Like I said, it's a pale version of the yellow pine, but often I can understand why many people might confuse it. I have actually seen Ponderosa pine at my local Home Depot here in Maryland. I think a lot of times they just get lumped together. And if you're at a break of bulk point where there's both hem fir and Doug fir and Ponderosa pine all coming together, it's possible they could even get repackaged or even dropped on a truck and shipped to Home Depots, east of the Mississippi and kind of get spread out. Workability wise, I think you'll find the Ponderosa pine is a little bit harder, a little bit stiffer than like the hem fir that we're dealing with, but not enough, at least from a structural perspective, that you would need to say, oh, I should use this for 2x4s and this not for 2x4s. They're pretty much the same in that respect. But the Ponderosa pine is also kind of a cultural icon. It's this linchpin almost of Western forest ecosystems, and of course, a workhorse in the lumber industry. But it's also got this legend status among Native American tribes, even early kind of Western spaghetti, Western Clint Eastwood type lore. I'm thinking about a Simpsons episode where they decided to watch Paint Your Wagon because they thought it was like a gritty Clint Eastwood Western, and Paint Your Wagon, you may know, is actually a musical. And they started singing about painting wagons and how it was made out of pine, Ponderosa pine. So yeah, not only is it in Western lore, but it's in pop culture lore because Ponderosa pine makes an appearance in The Simpsons. But what doesn't, honestly? Come on. They predicted Trump as president. They've kind of got their finger on everything. But it's earned its name, big, heavy pine, in a lot of different cultures. Several Native American languages translate to big, heavy pine. And it was often known that way by Western settlers as well. The Native American people basically it was a presence, a ponderous presence in their cultures. It was used to symbolize strength, also wellness and healthiness. A lot of times the resins were used for medicinal purposes, but also kind of ceremonial. When a child was born, they would build a cradle board out of Ponderosa pine and they would hang it up in the tree. They would build it out of Ponderosa pine, then hang it in a Ponderosa pine for like a blessing from the spirits for that child to grow up big and strong. At the same time, when a boy had outgrown, actually I would say a boy or a girl, but I don't know, it was probably just a boy, and they'd outgrown their cradle, they would hang the cradle up in the tree as a blessing that that child who had graduated, matured out of the cradle, would continue to grow strong like the mighty Ponderosa. Several tribes would throw smoldering Ponderosa pine cones towards the rain clouds to stop the rain. It was that power was felt. The Ponderosa pine had that kind of power. So definitely a presence, definitely an icon in their symbolism. But I mean, as a whole, they would symbolize endurance, resilience, and longevity. Average Ponderosa pine can run 100, 120 years, and many older than that. But these suckers are just huge, and they're just felt to be strong. So yeah, a lot of naturalists, Western settlers would write poems, write essays about the awe-inspiring nature of the Western yellow pine forests. So yeah, the Ponderosa pine entered Western science really in the 19th century. First documented evidence was in 1826 when David Douglas, see, I had it in my own notes, David Douglas, could have been Joe Douglas, you wouldn't have known any better. David Douglas first encountered it near present-day Spokane, Washington. He recognized it as a new species and noted its ponderous wood, inspiring the Latin name Pinus ponderosa. On the American frontier, Ponderosa pine forests were prized for the settlers for timber. Large pines were logged heavily into the late 1800s. Its brother, lodgepole pine, if I remember correctly, that was a Navajo saying, whatever the translated to lodgepole. Both the Ponderosa and the lodgepole got kind of confused a lot, but that really long, straight trunk was perfect for felling and making that central lodgepole that all the purlins would be based off of in a log cabin. That was one of its primary uses, as well as all the other parts of a log cabin in the early 1800s or so. But the tree's significance continued to be prized. Significance? The tree itself continued to be prized. Flagstaff, Arizona was named after the flagpole made of Ponderosa pine. Apparently it was a really impressive flagpole. So today it's still Flagstaff, Arizona. On July 4th, 1876, they hosted the U.S. flag on this Ponderosa pine flagpole, and from then on it became Flagstaff, Arizona. The state tree of Montana is the Ponderosa pine. So yeah, a lot of lore and legends behind the whole thing. Certainly, as I've said, it's a very large tree. Among the tallest pines in the world, mature specimens can be anywhere from 60 to 120 feet tall, but fair number of them reaching 150, 160 feet as well. I mean, those would be the outliers, certainly. I definitely saw some 150, 160 footers when I was out in South Dakota. Just magnificent trees. The bark, very distinctive, but it also has a nice kind of yellow to reddish cast. If you go out into a Ponderosa forest near sunset, the whole thing glows. It just picks up the red in the bark, and that golden hour is literally glowing golden hour. It's absolutely gorgeous. But one of the other things in the afternoon sun is you'll find that the Ponderosa pine is very sweet smelling. It smells like vanilla or butterscotch. All that resin in the outer cambium and in the bark heats up in the sun, and it puts off that smell. And if you work with Ponderosa pine, especially if you're hand planing or doing anything that's going to cause friction and heat up the wood a little bit, you will get that same sweet smell coming out of it. Region spans Western North America. It's actually the most widely distributed pine species in North America. Its natural range spans 68 U.S. states, covers about 27 million acres of U.S. forest land, and accounts for over 35% of the forested area in some states. So this kind of really underscores its ecological dominance, and that's where I talk about it being a linchpin of some ecosystems. It's estimated the standing volume of Ponderosa pine timber is about 188 billion, with a B, board feet. Yeah, the tremendous amount of biomass alone, it's just an opportunity for wood use, but also for responsibility and sustainable management. With so much at our fingertips, yeah, it felt like it was never going to run out. And it got logged, not to death, but heavily and irresponsibly in much of the 1800s. So then the pendulum swung the other way. And in more recent memory, we've kind of cut back and curtailed and put a lot of state and federal lands in place, which has kind of killed off a lot of logging in a lot of other areas, which has caused its own problem. You see, the Ponderosa pine is a fire propagating species. So when the forest fire starts up, all of its branches are far above the fire line, and that really those big plates of the bark are very fire resistant. So the fire will pass right through, blow out the undergrowth, but not affect the trees itself. But the rising heat will hit those pine cones, and they're really tight, resinous, and locked together. And the only way the seeds can disperse from the cone is when the cone opens up. But with that cone locked closed with the resin, it has to melt. So the heat from the fire melts the resin, allows the cone to open up, and that disperses the seeds. So the Ponderosa can't actually continue to grow and spread throughout its range without fire to do that. So as we stopped cutting a lot of things, it wasn't spreading naturally. But then there wouldn't be a fire coming through to clear things out, and the forest got denser and denser and denser and greater competition, which weakened all of them, and enter the Rocky Mountain pine beetle. Not an introduced species like the emerald ash borer or any of that type of stuff. This is a native beetle that lived here all the time, and everybody lived in harmony together because the trees were strong and can fight off the beetles. Well, once the trees got stressed, the beetles took over, and they are winning in big fashion, killing millions and millions and millions of trees and acres of land across the Rocky Mountain West, which is now leaving dead standing, you guessed it, tinder for forest fires. So now forest fires are burning out of control all across the West. And a lot of that could be mitigated by healthy forest management. In other words, thinning. The number one forestry practice for Ponderosa pine these days is just thinning. They're not clear cutting them anymore, and that used to be what was happening, was all clear cutting. We're not doing that anymore, obviously, and now we've discovered that we don't need to clear cut. If we just thin, we can simulate forest fires. Sometimes we can do selective clear cutting. Well, maybe we'll cut like a long band, almost like we dug a fire line around the forest. We'll clear cut in that band to simulate a forest fire that came through, and additional seeding can happen. Now, without fires to open the cones, seeding may have to happen by forestry management, and they'll come through and seed them. I think Weyerhaeuser just recently celebrated like its 13th billion sapling planted. Don't quote me on that number. I read that somewhere. It was a large number, just put it that way. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is create what you would call park-like stands, where you have these big, widely spaced trees with minimal underbrush. If you didn't watch the video, or if you want to go back and watch all the trees I was blowing by in the car, that's what we're talking about. As I was driving through Custer State Park in South Dakota, they were already doing some clearing. And in fact, you could see on one side of the road they'd done clearing. On the other side of the road, they hadn't gotten to it yet. So the left side of the road was filled with underbrush and all kinds of old growth, and basically looked like a fire hazard waiting to happen. On the right side, where they had cleared, it looked like somebody had come through, cleaned out all the underbrush, and then like cut the grass, and you could wander amongst the trees, and they were probably 10 to 15 feet apart. You know, you couldn't touch one trunk and touch another trunk. They were far enough apart, but that park-like structure really allows less competition. The trees won't become stressed and attacked by the beetle. But it's also the same thing would happen if a forest fire came through and cleared all that out. And it does allow those trees to continue to be strong and continue to do their own thing. So like I said, unlike the clear cutting that normally happens, that selective harvesting, selective logging becomes the primary silvicultural method for the Ponderosa pine. I've talked about the beetles and all that fun stuff. I don't want to go too much into that because, frankly, it's just really sad. When you drive through large parts of the American West, you just see dead standing kindling everywhere. Let's talk about, it's mostly woodworkers listen to this show, right? Let's talk about some of the properties. Like I said, the wood grain, it's pine, but it's quite appealing. It does have a contrast between early and late wood. There's a density difference, but it's kind of a gradient transition. It's more of a medium transition instead of that really stark transition of like real southern yellow pine or something like Douglas fir. It kind of subtly moves from early wood to late wood, and it gives it that nice, less stripy appearance and more grainy appearance. You will find that there are resin canals, and they can be really full of the sticky stuff. So if you've ever gotten a bit of construction lumber and, it's weeping sap, or you get sap all over your hands or over your tools, frankly, that's construction lumber that wasn't raised to such a high temperature or held at a high temperature to set the sap. If it is a clear appearance grade material that's being sold for more fine woodworking, excuse that term, fine woodworking purposes, it has been dried more thoroughly and will have set that sap. But yeah, you'll find a fair bit of resin canals filled with all kinds of stuff. Knots are pretty common. When I showed that typical image, you find knots all over the place. Certainly because the tree is quite large in diameter and quite tall, clear cut can come out of it, but you tend to find narrower boards for that. Think of a lot of T&G wall paneling, T&G soffit material, even flooring will relatively narrow boards in order to get fully clear type things. But because of the tall nature of the tree, you can get a fair bit of length in your Ponderosa boards. You can end up with 16, 18, 20-foot boards from time to time. I should say I've talked several times about the blue stain from Beetle Kill Pine. That blue stain, certainly very attractive to a lot of people. It doesn't compromise the structural integrity by any means. So if you do look into Beetle Kill Pine, don't think you're dealing with like a really spongy, punky type wood. It doesn't affect the structural integrity. It just discolors the wood. So it's not really rotting. It's just staining more than anything else. What's interesting to note, though, I talk a lot that it is a yellow pine, but it's more of a paler version of yellow pine. And to underscore that point, Ponderosa pine is not an exterior wood. You don't want to build outdoor furniture out of it, not without putting a whole lot of finish on it. So unlike your southern yellow pines, your Virginia pine, your longleaf pine, your loblolly pine, this is not resinous enough to be an exterior wood. I think you'll find that most of that vanilla smell on the resin is in the outer layers, in the bark and the cambium, but not so much in the heartwood itself. It's a softwood, so there's no pore structure. It's a tracheid structure. Tracheids are going to be, let's see, what am I saying here? Tracheids are pretty large. Yeah, that's true. In the early wood, you're going to find relatively large tracheids, and then that gradual transition into closer, tighter packed tracheids, which is what causes that contrast. Like tighter packed, denser tracheids in the late wood will create those stripes, and the wider, larger ones are going to be paler, less dense. That's what's really creating that contrast look to the wood. Rays, relatively narrow, but very, very, very frequent, to the point where you might think you're looking at a tracheid structure and that's actually rays. It's almost like static overlaid across your tracheid structure when you look at a clean ingrained piece here. But it's pine. It's relatively easy to work. Its Janko hardness is about 450, 460 foot-pounds. Density, 28 pounds per cubic foot. About 0.45 density. So, it's lightweight, but it's less dense than a lot of the structural pines. Yeah, and pretty soft, about half as hard as southern yellow pine, similar to more cedars and northeastern white pines. Bending strength, 9,400, so medium to low. Fine for light construction, frankly. Stiffness, 1.2, 1.3 million. So again, fairly low, but the beams will deflect. It's more, however, than Douglas fir of the same size, which is interesting. Because Douglas fir is really known to be a pretty stiff wood, but Douglas fir is often also sold in timbers. Large, when it's used for timber framing, it's 6x6s and 8x8s. But if you were to use, a 3/4 by 4 piece of soffit material, you'll find that the Ponderosa is actually a little bit stiffer than the Douglas fir in that thickness. One of those fun little things. Shrinkage, 6.2 tangential, 3.9 radial, and a pretty straight grain. If you just look at the tree itself, that tall, straight as an arrow trunk tells you that you're going to have pretty agreeable straight grain wood here. Fantastic at holding fasteners. It's a construction grade lumber. It is a pine. It's going to have varying density, so it is going to be a blotchy wood. Some people love blotch. If you don't like blotch, I recommend some sort of sanding sealer or stain sealer, blotch control, whatever you want to call it. 1 pound cut of shellac if you want to get rid of the blotchiness. But overall, it's a pine, but it doesn't have the crazy gnarly, like super radical density difference that you would have in Douglas fir or the really, really resinous southern yellow pines. And it's not nearly as hard, but so it's easy to work, but not as boring as northeastern white pine or a lot of the hem fir that you see in eastern construction lumber. I find the grain to be a lot more interesting and frankly a lot easier, more mellow to work with enough kind of oomph in strengthness and hardness to allow it to take details pretty well. It's a lovely wood to work with. I wish I had better access to it out east. I have a couple of Ponderosa boards and very tiny little pieces left over that frankly are left over from my days of living in Colorado. So yeah, for those of you living out west or those of you traveling out west, go pick up some Ponderosa pine. It's some nice stuff to work with. But I think that is enough of me talking about Ponderosa pine. It's a cool species. If you haven't tried it, haven't worked with it, go see if you can get it. You know what? I should actually talk a little bit about the grade. I did say I would talk about this. So there are appearance grades and there are structural grades. When we think of hardwoods, we think of first and second FAS as kind of the top grade, even though it's not an appearance grade, it's more of a cutting grade, but we think of that as the clear, air quotes around the clear stuff. In softwood, you don't really see that. So the highest really appearance grade, essentially clear with little to no knots, is C grade, or C and better. I don't know that there isn't an A or a B grade. I don't know that. Softwood grading is a whole other ball of wax. Frankly, it's very difficult. But yeah, for the good stuff, the clear stuff is a C select or C and better grade. D select is nearly clear, very minor imperfections. It's probably high quality paint grade or maybe light stain grade. Smaller kind of furniture components, whereas that C select, C and better is natural stain grade interiors, cabinetry, moldings, a lot of molding work for its, length, availability, and like Western construction, crown, trim, base, etc. Go down to D and then down to number 1 common. Sound tight knots have kind of a small size. This is used for paneling, especially that knotty style paneling, shelving, maybe fascia where knots are acceptable. Go to number 2 common, you've got larger, more frequent knots, but they're still sound tight knots. So shelving, possibly siding. I see a lot of siding in this soffit material. I guess if you wanted to build rustic grade furniture, sometimes general interior work, but often paint grade at that point. Go to number 3 common. Now the knots are more frequent. Some are loose knots or, they're just gone and holes to the board. Now you're in the realm of subflooring, crate pallet lumber, fencing, I guess, even though it's not an exterior grade, I guess it's disposable fencing, coarse siding. But then you can go all the way down to number 4 common where there's a lot of defects, unsound knots, cracks. Now we're into packaging, pallet material, etc. Temporary construction like form boards for concrete or for holding up walls before you nail the sill plate in. Then there's the structural number 1 and 2 better, which is graded entirely for strength, moderate knots, straight grain. But that's your 2x4s, your joists, rafters, etc. Structural number 3, it's certainly knottier. And that's in light framing where the knots are compromising some of the strength there. Non-critical uses like blocking and bracing, additional headers where you're putting blocking over top of a header, diagonal bracing, things like that. It's not your studs or your sill plates. It's the other stuff that goes in. Then, of course, there's shop grades, which is really thick boards that are graded by gluing together a bunch of stuff. So it's your laminated boards. Those are shop grades. And then of course, timbers. Those are your 4x4s, 6x6s, 8x8s, etc. So, there's a whole grading system behind not only just Ponderosa pine, but a lot of the construction pines. But ultimately, to handle a piece of pine is to handle a piece of the American West. It's the natural legacy of the wood. There's so much more to it than how we're using it today. There's just so much lore, and literally the American West was built with this stuff. So I'm a fan, if you can't tell, Ponderosa Pine, and I'm happy to feature it as our selected species, our featured species this month. So again, Madman Shannon's crazy sticker sale. If you become a walnut tier supporter of Patreon, patreon.com/lumberupdate, you're going to get this Ponderosa sticker. If you join in in October, you're going to get the Ponderosa sticker. You're also going to get last month's Catalpa sticker, plus 5 more stickers. I'm just going to randomly choose them from a box. There will be no duplicates, I promise. But you'll end up with 7 stickers. So thank you for supporting me so far. Thank you to everybody else in the future who supports me going forward. But that's the sticker you're getting. Are we ready to talk some questions? I'm ready to talk some questions. I think I've exhausted all I can say about Ponderosa Pine. Let me look at my notes here. So this is from Aaron. He says, I just found your show. I love it. Thank you, Aaron. I built a dehumidification kiln a few years ago, and I've had moderate success at drying lumber that has been cut using an Alaskan mill. Recently, I've run into, checking and a lot of movement in the wood. And I've tried to mitigate this by stacking and stickering them using ratchet straps to keep the stack weighted. I've also tried to creep up the drying by slowly ramping up the dehumidifier over a couple of weeks to not shock the wood. But most of what I've learned is through trial and error, and while that's fun, it can be expensive and wasteful. It'd be nice to have a more consistent technique. So this is the question, is there a set of guidelines that I can follow in terms of species, thickness, and moisture content to ensure more consistent results in my kiln drying? The answer is abso-friggin-lutely. Kiln schedule is what you're looking for. Go into Google, go into ChatGPT, pick your favorite LLM and say, where can I find a kiln schedule for insert species here? But more importantly, if you go to the Forest Service's USDA.gov website, research.fs.usda.gov, I will put this in the show notes, but you can get a link to kiln schedules for like 500 different species. And the kiln schedules are going to show you what your wet bulb, your dry bulb temperatures, the time you're holding for thickness, and species. It basically gives you your actual schedule, your recipe to dry. There's been a lot of trial and error, but that trial and error has been figured out for a lot of these species over time and thickness. There's no need for you to figure out anymore. If you have the ability to take wet bulb and dry bulb temperatures, or even just one of those two with the dehumidification kiln, you will have an exact schedule that you can follow. You'll even be able to, a little bit further Googling, you'll be able to find these for exotic species as well. This is, I don't want to say it's not a science. It certainly is a science, but it's also not a trade secret. It's not like people are guarding this anywhere, like the 11 herbs and spices. You can certainly find it, Aaron. So good luck with that. And let me know how you make out with that. If you have additional questions about deciphering those kiln schedules, I'm happy to help on that. Next question is from Doug. He said, I've read in the news about a month ago how between Georgia Pacific and International Paper that 5 paper mills in the state of Georgia were shutting down. Not to dismiss the economic toll this will take in the surrounding communities, but what happens to all of the timber that was destined to be processed in these mills? Is this something that can be turned into lumber? So the shorter answer is yes, with how much do you want to spend, but attached to that. So if you wanted to go from, let's talk about this. So pulpwood is really what we're talking about for paper mills. And there are forests that are managed specifically for pulpwood. These are going to be narrow diameter, short trees turned on a very, very high turn rate, couple of years at most. The material is certainly not for lumber purposes. It's ground up and used for the paper mill. It's mostly chips that are delivered to the paper mill. So without a paper mill to take those chips in, there's not much to do with it at that point once they're already chips. So the solution becomes don't take those trees down and let them grow longer to turn into timber stock. So silviculturally speaking, the first thing you need to do is thin. So you want to reduce the competition among the trees. These pulpwood trees are broadcast seeded and they're just growing in clumps, dense clumps that you can't possibly walk through or navigate through. Now, over time, a lot of pine species, softwood species, will mitigate that on their own. As they get taller, they will drop their lower branches and a lot of that undergrowth will die off. But if you wanted to speed up that process and not wait 10 years for that, maybe 15 years for that to happen on its own through succession, you can go back to my episode about a successional forest. This is what we're talking about. So go in and thin that underbrush to reduce that competition among the trees and allow selected individual trees to grow larger and straighter with less competition. Now you got to be careful here because you remove too much of the undergrowth, they lose some of their protection. So you might have to do this in phases where you remove just a little bit of the undergrowth and you let the young trees still kind of huddle together and use each other as windbreaks. And then as they grow up a little bit taller, maybe go back in a year or two and thin even more and select which of the trees are doing, the strongest there. So removing those poorly formed trees reduces the overcrowding, which also reduces forest fire risks. Typically, this would be done at 10 to 15 years of age in your pine plantation. So your pulp plantation is probably going to be less than 5 years old. So you want to go in and thin it out. Maybe at the 5-year mark for that initial thinning, go back between 10 to 15 and thin it again. And that again is to make sure that they don't lose that shelter when the little tiny saplings and then just all die. So this is going to certainly promote diameter growth in the trees, which is certainly going to improve the quality for timber. This is going to require a lot longer rotation here to pull this off. So you need to allow those trees to grow beyond their pulpwood into saw timber class, which is really 20 years at minimum, probably more like 30 to 40 years for decent saw timber, at least saw timber that you're going to get any kind of profit out of. 34 years is your term. So you're thinning, but then you're also managing and keeping it thinned, pruning branches if necessary. Some species will self-prune, but you're going to have to continue to manage that for, another 20 years past that initial thinning, probably at minimum another 20 years. This is, again, going to improve log diameter, which is going to increase structural integrity. So if you can sell this material for structural grade and or appearance grade, you're going to have more options when it comes to selling it. Finally, you may need to go in and selectively plant to improve the genetic stock a little bit, because pulpwood, nobody cares what the species is. Nobody really cares what's going on. You may find a whole bunch of different species in there or really just thrown in there for fast growth. Pulpwood doesn't really care about early or late wood or any of that stuff. So depending on how that forest is growing up, you may need to assess what exactly do I have here and do I need to create dominance with a certain species. And that can just be planting to increase competition in some respects and maybe weed out some of the weaker trees. And then, as I mentioned before, pruning, constantly pruning to control those knots, prevent pin knots from turning into big giant knots to create a clearer lumber. And remember, even if you're talking about structural grade material, the more knots in it, the less strength it will have. Knots are a definite weak spot. So even if you're thinking, I'm just going to sell this for 2x4s, you got to still prune some of those branches to get a structural grade. Really, if you had just clear cut, timeline we're talking about, fertilization, 0 to 2 years to boost that early growth. 3 to 8 years pruning to reduce undergrowth, then kind of more thinning in that 10 to 12 year period, and then just stay in the course from 15 to 35 or 40 years. That final harvest somewhere in that 40-year range is going to give you mature, high quality saw timber logs. So let's talk about this. Financial performance of this. I've got some interesting notes on this. You can expect probably the initial investment, capital up front, but you're talking measured in the hundreds of dollars for seed trees, seed, etc., not including the cost of the land. Thinning at year 10 doesn't really cost anything other than just material. So your low capital is probably anywhere about $900 per hectare to get started. But over time, you can expect a rate of return of about 9% annually on that. So I'm not a stock guy, but let's just round up and say that that investment is $1,000. That's going to grow 9%. What is that? $90? Yeah, $90 per year. So over 40 years, the compounding on that, I'm not going to do that math, but really you could probably stand to do pretty well with a 9% return. I would take that bet all day long in the stock market. So it depends upon the volume and the amount of trees that you have and kind of the actual dollar you might see. But a 9% return that's basically, I was querying a couple of LLM models and factoring out some long-term both lumber scaling or log scaling all the way down to forest concession plans. And on a 40-year yield, you could do pretty well. So lumber, on the greater picture, actually can be pretty profitable when you think about a 9% return. The reason it's not profitable is that 40-year turn and all of the work that goes into maintaining it. And that's a little hard to quantify. And it depends upon the scale of your plantation. If it's a relatively small plantation that an individual can maintain, it might be quite profitable for that individual. But the minute you've got to start bringing in machinery and multiple people, that plantation's got to get larger and larger and larger to cover that overhead. So you can see why like 40% timber loss in Georgia after Hurricane Helene is particularly devastating. So interesting question, Doug. You probably didn't expect that I would go into so much detail on that. Hell, I didn't expect that. I got a little carried away as I was doing my prep for the show. Final question. Alexander wrote in and said something that's always evaded me was framing lumber from the 1920s in the Northeast U.S. specifically. What species is it? I've replaced a lot of original tongue and groove porches that are clearly in great condition, old growth, tight grain, softwood. My initial guess was coastal Douglas fir because of the softness and tightness of the grain and the rot resistance. But I don't think it was commercially exported to the East for residential or really at any large scale during the 1920s. One day, I found the remnants of a lumber stamp on one of the boards, and it was from a mill in Missouri. I doubt they'd be importing logs of Douglas fir from the coast just to mill on site in Missouri. It smells like wet dog at first, and then after planing, it becomes slightly sweeter and sweeter in smell. Mostly, I just want to know what was being used for residential stick framing in the Northeast in the 1920s. I would suspect that particular board, due to the sweet nature and that nasty kind of wet dog smell, was probably hemlock. Hemlock is kind of notorious for how nasty it smells when it's wet, but it does get sweeter as it heats up. So I would guess it would be hemlock. Certainly hemlock was used widespread across the Northeast during the 1920s. Ultimately it was whatever species was locally abundant. Like you said, you doubt they're going to bring Doug fir to a mill in Missouri to saw it. So what was coming out of the mill in Missouri was whatever was around the mill, growing around the mill in Missouri. Same thing with a mill in Connecticut. It's going to be whatever's growing around it. But Douglas fir was definitely pretty common across the United States, coast to coast, by the early 20th century. It was already being shipped east by rail in the late 1800s. So by 1920, it was highly possible to find Douglas fir. Douglas fir was a great shipbuilding wood for a long period of time. It was certainly found in the eastern ports. So yeah, just leftover means that it might have ended up in framing material, because whatever was widely available is what they framed and stood up that house in. So if they'd gone to a lumber yard, they might have gotten one thing. If they went to a salvage yard or bought it from a shipbuilding dude, it could have been Douglas fir. It's hard to say. Certainly eastern white pine obviously was across the Northeast there. Nice lightweight white wood, easy to cut and nail, certainly showed up. Hemlock is native to the Northeast. Sometimes it's maybe less desirable because it's splintery and maybe harder to work with, but certainly you found it all over the place. My house was built in the 60s. I have hemlock studs throughout the house. Spruce is another one. Eastern spruce, like a red spruce, used heavily for framing and sheathing. And then, of course, southern yellow pine. Not really native to the Northeast, but definitely shipped in because of the quantity available from Virginia, mid-Atlantic, southern Maryland. The difference of my forests up here in northern Maryland to 2.5 hours south in southern Maryland it might as well be Williamsburg in southern Maryland, whereas it might as well be Connecticut up here in northern Maryland. So certainly I would say southern yellow pine, spruce, hemlock, eastern white pine, but you might be surprised how much Douglas fir actually was showing up in framing lumber in the 1920s in the Northeast. Once we drove that golden spike and connected the railroads, lumber was flowing back and forth across the country. Lumber was one of the largest things that was being moved in the railroad. In fact, I've got some notes in a future episode to do about lumber and the railroad industry. In fact, where I took some of the footage from today from Ponderosa Pine, I took some similar footage along some railroad tracks on the Mickelson Trail outside of Deadwood. So in the future, you will see something about the railroad industry and lumber. Really fascinating stuff. But that's enough for me. I think I've talked your ear off long enough. I think we can call it a day. And just thank you for listening. Thank you for watching if you watch this on YouTube. Go buy some lumber. Go buy some Ponderosa Pine, whether it's select structural grade stuff or it's the really, really fancy clear stuff, or a little bit of both, and you cut out the knots and you use what's left in between to build something pretty. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for supporting the show. And don't forget to get your crazy sticker deal. See you next time.